Hello, friends. Before I tell you a real scary story, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. My name is Michael, and I want to tell you a story that happened to me a few years ago. That summer, my friends and I decided to go on a road trip across the USA. We rented a car and planned our route to cover as many interesting places as possible. It was supposed to be the trip we had dreamed of for a long time. On the third day of our journey, we left Las Vegas and headed for the Grand Canyon. The road was long, and we decided to take a shortcut through a lesser-known highway that ran through the desert. At first, everything was great. We listened to music, discussed our future plans, and enjoyed the scenery. The road was deserted, and we hadn't seen a single car for hours. This made us a bit uneasy, but we didn't pay much attention to it. Suddenly, our car started acting strangely. The engine made a strange noise, and we felt the car begin to lose speed. Within a few minutes, we were stranded in the middle of the desert with no cell service. We got out of the car and tried to figure out what was wrong. Jessica, my girlfriend, suggested checking the spare tire and the fuel level, but everything was fine. John, our friend who knew a thing or two about cars, said the problem was likely with the engine, and we wouldn't be able to move without help. With no cell service, we decided to wait and hope that someone would drive by and help us. Time passed, and the sun began to set. The evening in the desert was cold and dark. We built a fire and sat around it to keep warm. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. Suddenly, we heard a noise coming from the depths of the desert. It sounded like rustling or footsteps. We looked at each other, but no one dared to speak. John stood up and walked toward the sound. We waited, but he didn't come back. An hour passed, and we began to worry. We decided to go look for him. We grabbed our flashlights and followed his tracks. After walking a few hundred meters, we stumbled upon an old abandoned motel. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. We approached and saw a light coming from one of the windows. The motel's doors were open, and we went inside. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. We began searching the rooms for John. Finally, we found him in one of the rooms. He was sitting on the floor, white with fear. "We need to get out of here," was all he said. We helped him up, and he told us he had seen shadows moving through the motel. He tried to escape, but the door had closed behind him, and he couldn't open it. We decided to leave the motel immediately, but when we got outside, we saw our fire had gone out, and it was pitch dark. We heard the same rustling again, but this time it was much closer. We ran to the car, but when we reached it, we found the tires had been slashed. We realized we were completely defenseless now. We got into the car and locked all the doors, hoping it would protect us. The rustling grew louder. We saw figures emerging from the darkness. They were approaching us slowly, like ghosts. We couldn't make out their faces, but we felt their sinister presence. Suddenly, one of the figures approached the window and knocked. Jessica screamed, and we all scrambled to the back seats. The figure kept knocking, and we saw its hands slowly sliding down the glass, leaving bloody streaks. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and an eerie silence fell. We stayed there until dawn, not daring to move. As the first rays of the sun began to light up the desert, we saw the figures were gone. We decided to leave the car and walk. We walked for several hours until we saw a distant truck. The driver stopped and helped us. We told him what had happened, but he just listened silently and didn't ask any questions. When we reached the nearest town, we immediately went to the police. They went to the spot where we had left the car, but they found no traces of the motel or the figures. They found our car, but it was in perfect condition, with no signs of slashed tires. Since then, I never travel on little-known roads and always plan my route carefully. This story will forever remain in my memory, reminding me that sometimes the scariest things can happen when you least expect them. I always loved traveling, but this trip changed my life forever. It was supposed to be a regular road trip from New York to Los Angeles. I planned to spend a few days on the road, enjoying the scenery and freedom. But what I experienced was far from a regular journey. The day started well. I woke up early, packed my things, and hit the road. My car, an old but reliable sedan, was ready for the trip. I always followed traffic rules, so I drove carefully but confidently. The first few hours passed calmly. I listened to music, stopped for coffee, and admired the scenery. Everything changed closer to sunset. I stopped at a small gas station in a tiny town somewhere in Pennsylvania. After filling up the tank and grabbing a snack, I returned to my car. Suddenly, I felt a strange sensation that someone was watching me. Turning around, I saw an old man standing by his old pickup truck. His gaze was intense, and his eyes seemed to bore into me. I didn't pay much attention to it and continued my journey. Night was approaching, and I decided to find a place to stay. Finding a small motel by the road, I stopped there. The motel looked old but acceptable. The administrator, a middle-aged man with a tired look, gave me the room keys. I climbed the creaky stairs and entered my room. The room was simple but cozy. The bed looked comfortable, and I was glad for the chance to rest after a long day on the road. I decided to take a shower and go to bed early to continue my journey the next day. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by a strange sound. At first, I couldn't understand what it was, but then I realized someone was scratching at the door. My heart began to beat faster, and I slowly approached the door. Listening closely, I heard a quiet whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Open up! Please, open up!" I stood in complete silence, trying to gather my thoughts. "Who is it?" I asked, trying to control my voice. There was no answer, only the scratching and whispering continued. Unable to stand it any longer, I abruptly opened the door. In front of me stood a woman in a white nightgown, her hair disheveled, and her face pale, almost transparent. Her eyes were wide open, and her lips continued to whisper, "Open up." I stepped back a few steps, unable to believe what I was seeing. The woman slowly raised her hand and pointed at me. "Open the door," she repeated, and suddenly disappeared, as if she had dissolved into the air. I stood there stunned and terrified, trying to understand what had happened. My hands were trembling, and I decided not to stay in this motel any longer. Quickly gathering my things, I ran out of the room and got into the car. The motel looked even more ominous from the outside than it did during the day. I hit the road, trying to leave this place behind. But peace did not return. I constantly looked back, afraid I would see that woman again. The road was empty, and only the moonlight illuminated the way. Suddenly, I noticed a figure on the roadside. It was the same woman. She stood looking directly at me, her lips whispering something incomprehensible. I accelerated, trying to drive past her, but as I did, she suddenly appeared in front of the car. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidded, and I came to a stop. My heart was pounding, and my breathing became heavy. Getting out of the car, I saw that no one was on the road. The woman had disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared. The feeling of fear and paranoia did not leave me. I decided to keep driving, hoping that the daylight would dispel this nightmare. But the horror did not end. Every time I stopped, I felt someone watching me. The next day, I reached a small town and decided to stop at a cafe to rest and collect my thoughts. Entering inside, I noticed the old man who had stood by his pickup at the gas station the previous day. He was sitting at a table, drinking coffee. I approached him and tried to start a conversation. "Sorry if you frightened me yesterday at the gas station," I said, sitting down next to him. The old man looked at me with curiosity. "I saw you left the motel in the middle of the night," he said. "That place has its own history. People say a woman's ghost often appears there, looking for help." My heart sank. "What's the story?" I asked, trying not to show my fear. The old man looked into my eyes and began to tell. "Many years ago, a tragedy occurred in that motel. A young woman stayed there during her journey, but she was found dead in the morning. Since then, her ghost has wandered the motel seeking help, but no one can set her free." Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. "Why does she haunt people?" I asked. They say she wants someone to open the door to peace for her, the old man replied. But no one knows how to do that. I thanked him for the story and decided not to stop on the road anymore. I continued driving, trying to leave this story behind, but it haunted me for a long time. Every night, when I stopped to rest, I heard whispers and scratching at the door. My journey, which was supposed to be a simple adventure, turned into a terrible nightmare. I never stayed in motels at night again, and even when I returned home, the image of that woman haunted me. This story left a deep mark on my life. It reminded me that even in a regular road trip, real horrors can be hidden, and that some doors are better left unopened. My name is Andrew, and this story is about a trip that changed my life forever. It all started one sunny morning when my girlfriend Emma and I decided to take a road trip across the USA. We planned to visit several national parks and spend time in nature, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. But what started as a romantic journey turned into a nightmare. We left early in the morning, packing everything we needed into our old pickup truck. The route was simple. We would drive through several states, stopping for the night in small towns or campsites. The first few days went according to plan. We enjoyed the scenery, admired the mountains and forests, and sat by the campfire in the evenings. One evening, when we stopped at a small gas station in Montana, an old man approached us. He looked tired and scared. His clothes were tattered, and his eyes were wild. "Don't go further down this road," he said, grabbing my hand. "There's a place where time stands still. People disappear there and are never found." I tried to smile and reassure the old man, but his words left a deep mark on my soul. Emma was anxious, but we decided to ignore his warning and continue on our way. The next day, we found ourselves on a road that looked abandoned. The asphalt was cracked, and it seemed like no car had passed here in a long time. The sun began to set, and the sky turned ominous shades of red and orange. "Andrew, maybe we should turn back?" Emma asked, looking at the map. "This road doesn't look safe." I hesitated but decided to keep going. We drove a few more miles when a figure appeared on the horizon. She was standing in the middle of the road, and we had to stop. It was a young woman. She looked tearful and frightened. Her clothes were torn, and her hair was disheveled. "Please help me," she whispered as I rolled down the window. "I'm being chased." I got out of the car, but Emma warned me. "Andrew, be careful. Something's not right here." The woman said her car had broken down on this road a few days ago, and she had been trying to find help ever since. She said she had seen people disappearing into the darkness and heard eerie sounds. We decided to help her and offered to drive her to the nearest town. But as we continued our journey, it became clear that something was wrong. The road seemed endless, and we couldn't find any signs or turns. Time passed, but it felt like we were driving in place. The sky began to darken, and a thick fog rolled in. The headlights barely penetrated it, and we felt fear gradually filling our hearts. Suddenly, the car stalled. I tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't respond. We were trapped. "We need to get out of here," Emma said, trembling. "This place is cursed." I agreed and decided to go look for help. The woman stayed in the car with Emma, and I took a flashlight and ventured into the darkness. I walked for hours but couldn't find any sign of life. Everything around was dead and silent. Suddenly I heard screams. They were coming from somewhere in the distance, and I ran towards the sound. As I approached, I saw an old house. It looked abandoned, but light was pouring out of the windows. I climbed the stairs and opened the door. Inside, there were people everywhere. They were sitting at tables, dancing and laughing, but their faces were empty and soulless. I tried to talk to them, but they didn't respond. They seemed like puppets. Suddenly, I felt someone watching me. Turning around, I saw the same woman we had picked up on the road. She was standing in the corner, looking at me with horror in her eyes. "You're here too," she whispered. "We're all stuck here forever." I realized we were trapped. I ran back to the car, but it was gone. Emma and the car were nowhere to be found. I was left alone in this eerie place where time had stopped. Every day I try to find a way out, but the road always leads me back to the same house. If you ever find yourself on an abandoned road where time stands still, remember, there is no escape. And if you meet a young woman asking for help, don't trust her. She's just a ghost leading you into a trap. This journey became my curse, and now I'm forever stuck in this endless nightmare.